where I thought I might have you each start as a starting point is to maybe give us your definition of what noospheric might be, noospheric consciousness, that is, its importance to humanity at this point in time, and how can we come to know more about it? I think one of the goals of our conversation this morning is for all of us to start to look forward. How, as a community, can we start to study and convene around these topics, as varied as they may be? How can we find some place for common dialogue? And you're welcome to comment on anything else at this point, too. If something I said was way off base, feel free to call that out as well. And so, Ilia, would you like to begin?
Well, sure, thank you. First of all, thank you for that excellent presentation. That was really wonderful. When I see this term collective consciousness, it's very interesting because I think certainly we are entering into a new level of awareness, and I'm thinking of Teilhard as well, as he posited this term, the noosphere. And one thing I think just to keep in mind, while he spoke about moving from individual consciousness to what he called a co-reflective consciousness, he also really thought that evolution was the advancement of thought. So it's not just being aware of, but thinking, in a sense, in the same direction. Then I was just pondering, what it is to think. And it's not just the information that's at our disposal, but for Teilhard, it's forming those horizons of insight that begin to push the whole forward towards greater wholeness, so to speak. So I think first of all, there's so much that was said in the last 2 hours. Let's just sum this up in noospheric consciousness. Is a little bit much, but I do think that we're on the cusp of something here that is perhaps it's paramount to begin these conversations. Collective, I still want to hold that term, sort of with some brackets around it, because even thinking about what Francis presented in the first part, then I've spoken about in terms of ages of consciousness, from first axial to second axial periods to a new age of consciousness. I think we're living right now, and in a certain way, we're living between stories. We're living between levels of consciousness. Not everyone evolves at the same time, because evolution is a local affair, and depending on your family, your history, the place of religion or no religion, so many factors go into what allows a person to move to new levels of consciousness. So I do think part of the anxiety of the present moment is evolution itself is speeding up because of AI, and yet I think there are other factors that are sort of holding this advancement in collective consciousness back a little bit. And so one of the things, I think you mentioned it, how do we bridge, again, I think religion and science, or spirituality and science, or mysticism and science, or whatever you want to call that other dimension that is not science per se. That's the part that, in Teilhard's vision, it's the withinness that, in a sense, does shape the withoutness. How do we come to that level of breakthrough of consciousness within ourselves that then contributes to this collective awareness outside ourselves? There's a saying I often use: when the level of our awareness changes, we start attracting a new reality. But the question is, how does our level of awareness change? It doesn't happen outside ourselves. It is that, what we might call the inner journey or the spiritual journey or whatever it is that, connects a person within. In the Jungian sense, it's coming into those deeper levels of the psyche. And so we've put forth a lot here in terms of what we're calling the collective consciousness, or the noosphere. Now how to begin to understand these various levels of things in a coherent way. I love that term, coherence, by the way. I love the idea of synergy. These are really important concepts for advancing into, but all of these big ideas they'll remain abstract ideas until they become, in a sense, more, until we ourselves come to a new level of groundedness within ourselves. And just my last remark, quite honestly, as I was listening to this, the talks this morning, if you want to talk about collective consciousness, you have to go to a Villanova Wildcat basketball game or a Packers football game, right? 80,000 people in a stadium, and they are completely on the same page. So, what's happening in that awareness so one of the things I just might put out there is a collective consciousness cannot remain an abstract term. You need something that collectivizes, whether it's a winning team, whether it's a value, whether it's the good of the earth, whatever it is, it has to be put in a concrete form. We don't do well with abstracts. That's where actually we start withering away into various camps. So I think that's one thing we'll have to, as the conversation proceeds, in terms of a collective awareness of collective consciousness. What is that consciousness of? What is it that binds us together in this more collective whole? So it's all yours, Terry. Or Francis, or whoever.
All right, I will pick up on that. But what I want to do is to back away from what I would call the shadow of Descartes. And a lot of our conversation about technology is a technology that doesn't talk about the physiology of our bodies, the energy that we demand just to be and to stay far from equilibrium as we are, not, in a sense, increasing the entropy of ourselves and of the world, which is one of the grand challenges we face. What I like, and of course, Michael and I have done work on this together, but what I find very interesting about the musical perspective is that, in fact, it's about the energy to some extent. It's not just the information. It's about all pattern, all information is embodied. It's embodied, it needs information, but it also needs metabolism, and it needs physical form. When we think about computation, oftentimes, we ignore the fact that what we do to find meaning is not just form and pattern. It's actually form and pattern about something. And to be about something means you've got to be grounded. And I think many of the comments that were worrisome comments that I hear from many people in the audience is how ungrounded sometimes our discussion of the future might be, how it does not pay attention to perspectives of indigenous people, of the environmental decline that we see in various places. Part of the Noospheric story and part of the story of consciousness is it's about being physically in existence. It's about being matter. It's about being energy. It's about being matter and energy in pattern, in structure, in coherence and incoherence. And one of the other big challenges is, of course, sometimes coherence, like you mentioned, I just love this example of being at a large meeting like that, but it reminds me also of what happened during Nazism. What happens, you can become also aligned in directions that are, in some sense, ungrounded. And one of the challenges of ideologies is that oftentimes can drive us away from that grounding. One of the things that this is about, of course, is to figure out the right grounding, to figure out how to ground the information, how to take our technologies and keep them grounded in the world. And the reason I like the musical perspective, and I also think about neural processes as a neuroscientist, time is a really crucial part of it as well. Computation built on what you might call the Turing model of how to do things does not really take into account time. Yes, one thing happens after another, happens after another, happens after another. But the one thing about life is it's totally asynchronous and can become synchronized, can become synergistic. And that's in time. That has to do with frequencies that match each other and what we sometimes describe as harmonies. And of course, that's one of the things that we feel comfortable with. And I think what we're recognizing is that it's not just the nervous system that works that way. When we talk about the evolution of higher order forms of organism, it also has to do with things in time, synchronized, because you can't work together. You can't run together. You can't do things synchronously unless you're also linked up in time. And so I really appreciated that move to talk about the brain as music, because I actually think that's what's going on.
Yes, I want to go back to this concept of coherence and alignment, because there are positive and negative forms of alignment, like Terry was already looking at, for example, with Nazism. Maybe the Germans were very much on one line about what was to be done and to conquer the world. That's not the kind of alignment you would like to have. There's a nice concept in sociology called groupthink. That means if you have a group of people that are closely interacting, typically in a special meeting, in a special group, they often kind of reinforce each other's opinions to such a degree that they deviate from the real world, and they convince each other about some idea that afterwards turned out to be completely not applicable. And that is because there are positive feedbacks in alignment. If I confirm you, then you are likely to go a little bit further, and then you confirm me, which entitles me to go a little bit further, and we push each other to go more and more extreme, and that is typically the kind of dynamics you see of polarization. So at this moment, you have alignments, but locally alignment, and they are often very non-grounded. That means they have lost touch with the real world. So what do you need? When I speak about complexification as integration and differentiation, the differentiation part is also important. You don't want everybody to be thinking the same and wanting the same. What you do want is that they are in synergy. That means that they are not obstructing each other, they are not fighting each other, they are not in conflict, but they can still be doing very different things, and preferably from different perspectives. So the collective consciousness for me does not mean that everybody is thinking or feeling the same at the same moment, but that people are working together in such a way that they complement each other. That means that the overall goal is emergent. It's a goal where the different contributions are not in contradiction with each other, but the different contributions are different. People look at different aspects. Some people, let's say, they focus on global warming. Some people focus on polarization. Some people focus on indigenous knowledge. Some people focus on this problem, on that problem. We need all these people, but we need them not to work at cross purposes. We need them to work in such a way that the one does not fight the other, but that they are complementary. And it's that kind of consciousness that you want, and that's also the kind of consciousness you find in the brain. If the whole brain is synchronized, that all the neurons are firing at the same time, that's what's called an epileptic attack. That is not a healthy brain state. A healthy brain state, there is some local coherence, but different parts of the brain are doing different things and they are complementing each other. So that is something which we need for this collective consciousness, which is not obvious to achieve, and that it needs more thinking and more science. One remark I also wanted to make is I read recently about the younger generation, and as I said, this younger generation is very pessimistic. And one of the things that they typically will say is that we are much better informed thanks to the internet than our parents, and our parents are not aware of how bad the world is. So the younger generation thinks they are well informed, but they are informed via social media, and we all know that social media are very biased in the kind of messages you get. So you think you are well informed, but actually you have a very biased type of information, typically the most dramatic, the most pessimistic, the most simplistic, the most emotional things. These are the kind of things you get informed about. All the things that are going on in the background, all the hard work that is improving the world in lots of different things, you don't hear about it because it's not spectacular, it's not dramatic, it's not emotional. And that is an example of how people can think that they are conscious of what's going on in the world, but actually they're not conscious. It's like you walk into a beautiful forest and there are millions of different plants and animals that are working in collaboration. And then there is some guy there with a loud radio, and the only thing you pay attention to is the loud music coming from that radio, and all the other things that are going on in the forest disappear from your consciousness. I think that lots of people are in that state. They feel they are informed, they feel that they are conscious of about what's going on in the world, but they are hearing this very loud music that's clamoring for their attention, and they're not aware of all these very subtle and complex interactions that they should be aware of.
Okay, let me make just a brief comment about that, and that's also a form of self-organization, and it's I think one of the worrying features about the way social media has worked. It amplifies certain things. As a result, people think, in a sense, in a very narrow way, as you were suggesting. That's a form of self-organization. Self-organization happens because of what gets amplified and what gets damped. And as a result, it recursively amplifies itself very, very rapidly. I think one of the challenges we're facing today is that we haven't figured out how to control that kind of self-organization in our communication systems. So it's both the source of organization and synchrony, but it's also the source of sort of over-synchronization that you were talking about. And we have not figured out yet in our social media and our forms of communication how to build around that. That's inevitable. It's going to happen that way. But in order to get the kind of, you might say, musical harmony we're talking about here, that needs to be overcome. And we haven't figured that out yet. But those of you in the room who are in that field, that should be something that we're all thinking about.
I just have a note maybe on the term collective, because as you were speaking, I was thinking of Teilhard's, something that's he has said that's quite well known, and that is union differentiates. The more I am in union with another, the more I am myself. Since it's the core of myself, that's the basis of union. Sometimes when we hear this term collective, we think of this kind of absorption. You were mentioning some of these totalitarian movements, and maybe that's the thing. Like, how do I know that this collective is better for me rather than diminishes me? And that is being part of a greater awareness, being part of this whole. Am I more myself? Am I more free? Am I more at home in this earth and with others? But his idea. So I think what we think sometimes is a collective as a whole, but in the Teilhardian sense, that whole is the maximization of diversity. So the greater the diversity, the greater the wholeness, since it's each aspect of diversity that contributes to the whole. In other words, the wholeness is increased by the maximization of the diverse parts. I think of it like a stained glass window, because the beauty that each part of each glass contributes to that whole. In itself, it's a piece of glass with a certain bevel. It has a particularity, but in the realm of the whole window, it has a particular light. It contributes to the overall brilliance of that light. So the idea that beauty is the maximization of contrast. So it's not a homogenization, it's a differentiation of what we are, what everything is, not just humans, but the sun, the moon, the stars, the earth, the soil, the trees. The beauty of the whole is precisely in the diversity and the differentiation of everything that exists. And in Teilhard's view, that increases that wholeness when love or a sense of the good becomes, the binding force of what we are together. And I might add here, I do love science, so I love to hear the scientific explanations of things. But we have to admit that science has had a bias against things like love, or the things of compassion, or these realms of meaning, which are not measurable sometimes. If they're not quantifiable or they're not measurable, or we can't put them in the graph, we're not really going to spend a lot of time talking about them. But it's those things we don't spend a lot of time talking about that may be the most vital things we need to really pay attention to. I think AI is doing great in building, into super AI, but we're not doing well because there are unsayable things we don't talk about enough that really need to become deepened. They need to become embodied more. That binds us together. The science is doing great. It's the other side of things that really needs our attention. So I hope we can keep the fires going here in these conversations.
That's great. Thank you, Ilia. That's actually exactly what I wanted to follow up on, because as the conversation was evolving, there was this, the talking about coherence and the assumption, well, coherence may be good, maybe not, synergy good, and immediately the normative dimension starts to enter into the picture here, and that's what you're really asking us to look at directly. And so I would love to maybe see if maybe either Terry or Francis want to follow up a little bit on that normative perspective, the idea of value. How do scientists work with this? Do we address it head on as a scientific problem? Are we leaving something out? Do we borrow from religion? How does that proceed? What does that look like?
Well, there is an old philosophical problem that is that ought does not follow from is. You can describe how the world is, that's what science does. It does not tell you how the world should be. You cannot derive value from observations. And another nice example of it is, I don't remember which philosopher said that you may have the most detailed schedule of the different trains. It does not tell you which train you want to take and which city you want to get off with. So my view is, how do I combine science with value? It is this thing I try to sketch in terms of evolution. You know that evolution eventually will lead to more fitness. But you also know that evolution is a blind process. It's a process of trial and error. That means it will make mistakes. It tries out some combination of things which apparently seems to work, but is self-defeating. Typically, you get that, for example, with parasites that are too successful. If a parasite is too successful, it kills its host, which means it kills not only its host, it kills itself. So evolution does make mistakes. You know that these mistakes will not last, because even if the parasite has killed itself and its host, there will be enough other organisms to try out different combinations. And then what typically happens is that the parasite will evolve more into a symbiote, meaning that the parasite will not kill its host, but will collaborate with its host. These are processes that you know in the longer term will win. In the longer term, the ones that are not self-destructive are the good ones. So now you can derive value from that and saying, I know evolution will eventually lead to that, but I don't want to make all these mistakes in the meantime. I don't want to create self-destructive systems. I don't want to create parasitic systems. So for me, the definition of good or evil is, good is that what in the long term can sustain itself and grow. Evil is that which eventually is self-defeating. To take a simple example, the war in Ukraine, Russia attacked Ukraine. It's obvious for everybody that Russia is only losing. It's a self-defeating war. They cannot win anything there. They are just losing out. Wars typically are self-defeating. That is why we consider war evil. So then you can think in the opposite direction is, what is good? What is good is some action which you know will in the longer term maximize this possibility of growth, of creative evolution. And I wanted to go back to the point that Ilia made about the diversity, the differentiation. Union differentiates. I want to give my favorite example of a good example of noospheric consciousness, and that's Wikipedia. You have these kind of filter bubbles, echo chambers, where you just get people reinforcing each other's idea and getting groupthink. What is Wikipedia? Wikipedia is a collection where the most diverse people have put in the most diverse perspectives. The whole point of a Wikipedia article is that you want an as balanced and as detailed possible treatment of any subject. That means if you read about a subject that you know something about and you find that a particular idea or perspective or aspect is missing, you add it. And that is what makes Wikipedia so strong, that is, it is not the view of one particular person. In a traditional encyclopedia article, you get one view of one particular author who, if it's a good author, will try to include as many perspectives as possible. But if you write an encyclopedia collectively, the way Wikipedia is, you will have a much more diverse, much more balanced view, and that is the kind of thing you want. So, union differentiate. The union is one Wikipedia that everybody can reach and everybody can contribute to. That's the integration part. The differentiation part is everybody who has an idea that is not yet in Wikipedia and that is solid enough to be there can add that idea. So union differentiate. The union is the internet, the World Wide Web, the Wikipedia site. The differentiation is the enormous richness of ideas that are being accumulated in Wikipedia.
All right, I'll just say a few words. And one has to do with the problem of what norms are. What norms are, and of course a very deep and old problem, but they always refer to something that we have been talking about but have never defined here. There's a benefit or a cost. Something benefits, something suffers. Something is right, something is wrong. Something fits, something doesn't fit. With respect to all of that, what determines that? What determines that is something like a self. Now, I don't mean a self like a person necessarily. It could be the health of an ecosystem, the health of an economy. Something benefits, something doesn't. Something fits, something doesn't. We have not talked about this problem of self much, and yet it's been in the background of almost all of our conversations here. We know that with the origins of life, we're beginning to see the sparkle of self showing up. We even talk about, even though we don't know for sure whether we want to call viruses alive or dead, we're actively trying to kill them, so to speak, trying to stop those that are making us sick. We recognize that they evolve. We know that at the very, very base of life, there's something like self. We talk about self-benefit, self-harm, self-reproduction, self-repair, and yet we're struggling with the concept of self. What we're struggling here with is also a higher order concept of self. And it's a real challenge because we don't even understand it completely at the level of organisms. And at the level of minds, it gets more complex. But now at this level of self that we're talking about, it's even more complex. But if you think about concepts of ethics and morality, they're about a higher level of self. It's not about myself. It's about ourself. It's about the collective self. And I think the clearer we are on the nature of that self, what kind of a self are we talking about? Forget high-level concepts like consciousness. Just what kind of a self are we talking about? That's a collective self. That's the larger homunculus that we're a part of. The clearer we are about that, the clearer we'll be about the normative features that we need to be striving towards.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, while I appreciate that, Terry, but I do think the self has an ineffable dimension to it. As much as I can reduce myself to my blood cells and my neurons, and I could be, I think it was a crick who said, you're just a pack of neurons. I was like, oh God. There's something about the human person that you really can't quite put your finger on. You can't measure it. There's a beauty of every particular person. There's a uniqueness. And I think that's one of the things that's feared today with AI. We're going to lose that distinctive uniqueness about what makes me me. Am I just going to become another machine-like person? Am I just going to be blended into the data? And that fear of the loss of not just the self, but the particularity of the self. So I think when we talk about particularity of the self, we're talking about the particularity of of everything. While science, and I love science, believe me. I believe that we need science to really reflect adequately on reality today. But science cannot get to the absolute bottom of what is, even the human person. There's always this kind of ineffable, even if I take you all apart, it's the who you are as a person. That's immeasurable, and that's, okay, here it is, what we call the divine part, right? That's the God part. And I think sometimes we kind of just push that, but that God dimension, spiritual dimension, however you want to frame it, that is the particularity that makes this person not replaceable by data, that this person has something unique and to contribute in a way that will last for all eternity. Your personal footprint on the whole of this collective noospheric evolution. And I think we don't want to lose that. We want to find a way into the noosphere with AI that values the particularity of personhood, the particularity of the tree, the particularity of the grain of sand, and not lose that distinctiveness. It's the beauty of life precisely in that. So I agree, we will never know the self. And the other thing is we don't do well with mystery, let's face it. We don't do well with ambiguity. We're always wanting to, to fall on one side or the other, but all of life, actually, when you look at the brain, and you go, wow, it's a lot of ambiguity. So most of life, from my perspective, is in the in-between, right? It's one side or the other, but we're always in this in-between. And I think living comfortably with ambiguity and being at home in that is a way then to participate more freely in this emerging AI noospheric life without having to understand everything. I love the fact that we're constantly driving to understand everything. This capacity, this capaciousness of the mind, which even science tells us this is the mind, and I'm saying the mind is even more than that. So this capaciousness to constantly pursue all of this, from my perspective, this is all the religious dimension of the scientific endeavor. In other words, science is fantastic, and then there's stuff that science cannot quite address. And I'm saying that's the mystical side, that's the ineffable side, whatever you want to call it. It's the side we need to bring in more into the conversation.
Allow me to mildly disagree. I think science is often misunderstood also by scientists. And there's a very simple principle that people tend to overlook, that is that the map is not the territory. Science makes models. Models are simplified descriptions. That means that the model is never the thing. So whatever you look at, even if it's something as simple as an electron, you can write a wave function of it. The wave function is not the electron. That is why any scientific description is not the thing. You can call that the ineffable, you can call that the mystical, you can call that the divine. That's just the way the world functions. You wouldn't want to have the description be equal to the thing itself. There would not be a sense to have a model that is exactly the same as the thing it models, because you better have the thing itself. A model is a simplification that allows you to make certain predictions. So what a model does is it tries to help you to make certain predictions. It cannot make all predictions. The world is not deterministic, but the models are tools that are useful. And you should not start from the assumption that there are certain things that can never be modeled, because then you get into this kind of a mode like, okay, there are the things that science can do, and there are the things that science can't do. The things that science can't do, that's the mystical, that's the divine, don't touch it. Then you get dangerously into a situation where you close off certain things and say, science can't do it. No, science can't do everything. Science, by definition, is limited. It can make maps. The map is not a territory. A model is a simplification. But I think you should not a priori say it will never be able to understand this or that. Like the hard problem of consciousness is one of these typical ones, like, okay, science can tell us what the brain does, but science will never tell us really what consciousness is. no, but science can make models of consciousness, and these models can tell us how our consciousness functions. It will never tell you everything. The model is not the consciousness, but it can tell you things that at this moment we would not even be able to imagine that it may be able to tell us. So I just want to say, of course, there will always be things that science doesn't tell us, but I don't want to make any a priori separation between the things science can tell us and the things science cannot tell us. And that, I think, is a tendency that people tend to take two different realms, the one that science can speak about and the one that science can't. Those two realms are not separate.
Yeah, I would fully agree with that. I wasn't saying that they're separate, actually. I was just saying that all knowledge is proximate. All knowledge is an approximation of the knowing, and the knowing itself. So all I'm just saying is the transcendent dimension of knowing is the ineffable. So that's the beauty of science. It's always moving towards the knowing of what is yet to be known, or the ineffable. It's not that there is an ontological category of mysticism that's different from science. Yeah, I would never hold
we
that
agree.
position. Yeah.
Let me sit in the middle here. I think the key here is humility. That is on
I agree.
both extremes, the ideological and the scientific. I think about my own work. From 50 years hence, looking back, certainly they will say many of the things that we thought were certain that we worked out. How could they have thought that? I think one of the important things for all of us in the science and technology world is to be humble about what we've accomplished and what we know and don't know. But the second thing is that the world has to be worked on. We have to do things. In order to keep things from running off the rails, we have to do things. And to do it right, we need to know how things work. Science is about trying to figure out how things work. If your car breaks down on the road and you know nothing about it, but you try to fix it, it'll only get worse. Science provides that side of it. And yet you have to be humble to know when you don't know how the car works. And you need somebody else to help you out. Mm-hmm. And I think that's our challenge. We're right now at that crux. We know a lot. We're really moving ahead rapidly. But we still don't know how it works quite. So long as we're humble and don't give up trying to figure out how it works, and then to use that knowledge the best we can, that's the best we can do.
Yeah, and maybe picking up on that, given Jennifer and the discussions yesterday, how do we bring what we're saying here into what someone called the third story or a new narrative? So I think this conversation itself is really a wonderful step into the future. But we do have to create some kind of operative, meaningful narrative, as science and spirituality, or science and value systems, or whatever you're going to call it, as we humbly walk into the future. What will be our new story together? That's, I think, what we have to really begin to put into shape a little bit, because I do agree that it's the stories that create meaning for us. In a sense, people are attracted. Someone once said to me, stories are more powerful than facts. I can be more moved to change by a story than I can be by a fact. And I do think we have to bring our tremendous knowledge from the sciences in line with a value system that we hold together in this new collective awareness into a new narrative. What is that? It's just an operative narrative, not the fixed story, but just something that we can tell together. What's the story that we would tell together from this conference, maybe?
One of the things I wanted to just briefly mention as part of this conversation, in particular on consciousness, collective consciousness, noospheric consciousness, what's the word we're going to find to use to talk about this emerging phenomena. At Human Energy, we're putting forward a proposal to write a book on this topic. And so we would like to invite authors, thinkers, anyone here who's at this conference that wants to contribute to start to think about that topic really in particular, and to see how we can bridge some of the disciplines that were discussed throughout the conference. So just wanted to mention that. And if you're interested, come talk to me or anybody else at Human Energy. And I want to thank Francis, Terry, and Ilia. Thank you so much for this roundtable, but also or lineup, I guess, as it may be, panel. It became a panel. Well, it felt like a roundtable, actually. You guys did a really wonderful job creating that sense. So thank you for that. Yes. It looks like we have at least, for those of you who want to take a break, please get up and do so. Greg, do you have a question? You feel free to go ahead and.
Well, it looks like it's working.
I think it's working. It's green.
Hello? Oh, great. So wonderful, wonderful panel. And I was captured a bit by this, the limitations of science to explain certain things and, the modeling and the purpose of science. It drew my mind to something larger. It's not just science, it's language and stories. And language is only able to represent certain things, at least well. And we get into realms that seem to be beyond our capacity to use language. So we sort of grapple with metaphor and all these things. And I was interested in some comments about that, because it seems to me there are things that we will have a great deal of difficulty representing and communicating. And, stories are very powerful, but how far do they go? And then one other point is we talk about it as though we can understand this language, this global mind. It feels to me we don't even see it except through shadowy sort of reflections through it. We're a little lens and see tiny parts of it, but we're very inadequate to really see that or understand its larger purposes and meaning. And I think the difference between the cell, the neuron trying to understand the purposes of the person, it's really, we're in the same position when it comes to that. So any comments?
Let me make a quick comment, because I think that we underestimate, particularly if you're outside of the sciences, underestimate how much of science is driven by metaphor and analogy. That's how we discover new things. We discover new things because it's a little bit like that I've seen before. When we talk about evolution or the nervous system as a model, it's a metaphor. It's an analogy. Some parts are going to work, some parts are not, but that's how we move forward. And stories play a major role in that, but also the fact that not knowing, but knowing that it's a little bit like something else is a very powerful feature in our thinking. And so what we're struggling with here, of course, is that we're now moving into a territory where we don't have good models. And of course, it's going to start out being very metaphoric. So it's going to start out being very analogical, but that's the first step towards figuring it out.
Yeah, I really appreciate your comment, Greg. The limits of language sometimes, and what Terry was saying, language as just, building these models, having ways to conceptualize what we're trying to understand. And yet, sometimes the reality itself exceeding, what we can say. Teilhard himself, tried coining new language. It didn't work too well. He coined words like amorization or planetization. He put everything in the context of a verb, because what he's saying is what we're involved in now is not something that's static and ontological. It's something that's dynamic and interconnected. So I do wonder sometimes, do we need to find new language to describe the new reality we're in? And then how to, in a sense, inscribe that language into our culture and stuff. So yeah, it's an interesting question and work to do.
I just add one quick point to that, Ilia. I really appreciated just from, your presentation. You brought in words that I would have, as a scientist, would have been like, I have no idea what you're talking about, like Catholicity, right, for example. And then to sort of learn that has this sort of sense of greater wholeness and the differentiation that you're talking about, then it starts to have much deeper resonance with the scientific topics that we're talking about. So I think I just wanted to comment on that, because there's a way that those ideas are then maybe picked up by a scientist somewhere who might come to a new understanding of it and adopt it in the way that Terry's using it. Oh, it's nothing like that, but it totally reminds me of what happened over here, right, in that way. So I really appreciate that.
Great, thank you.
I have three phrasings of one question. How can we navigate effectively in the precarious divide between diversity and chaos? How can we navigate the opportunity and responsibility of global order and governance and the emplacement of nationhood and the collective amidst the pernicious risk of fascism and tribal factionalism and the schisms which cause decay? How can we productively say no as well as yes?
A very difficult question, but I was reminded recently of how do you create factionalism? There is one way. There are so-called scissor statements about which half of the people very much agree and half of the people very much disagree. If you throw such a scissor statement into a society, you will create factionalization, you will create polarization. So maybe we should think about the opposite, throwing in statements that everybody can agree with and throwing around these statements instead of emphasizing the differences of opinion, emphasizing the things people agree about. And I think most people agree about most things. Most people agree about the importance of peace, the importance of not wasting, the importance of efficiency, the importance of education, the importance of science, the importance of spirituality. If we could create a number of these kind of statements that are sufficiently concrete that they wouldn't be immediately dismissed as some abstract statement, and then inject those into all these conversations on social media, maybe that would be a way to bridge the factions.
I might, as you were talking, I don't know if you've ever read the introduction to Teilhard's Hymn of the Universe, but he's writing, part of that he's writing in 1917. He's a stretcher bearer in World War I. He's literally writing from the trenches, like he's jotting down notes as people are literally being shot and dying all around him, and he has to carry the dead and the wounded. And if you read that, you would never know he was in the midst of the horror of war. He is talking about the future. He's talking about something that's emerging here, and it's so hopeful. You think either this guy totally lost it or something else is going on here. There's something about Teilhard's, if I can use the word optimism or faith in the future, that he really believed, it's not just a belief system of a blind belief. He's an evolutionary biologist, so he's looking at patterns in evolution. And he's saying something is going on here that meets the eye. And and in his view, it's not to negate the reality. That's there, that is for sure. But to be attentive to seeing something that is even more than that immediate reality. There's something else taking place. And I think, what he asks us to is to use our senses to see what are the new patterns that are emerging, and are we attentive to what those new patterns are? Because we can get caught in that vortex of war and destruction and evil. And then we too are part of the death of everything taking place. So I would just encourage you to read Teilhard's writings in that regard. Yeah.
Hi. When you were talking about music, you seem to be referring to a kind of music that is often referred to as absolute music, which in terms of classical music is music that's written for its own sake with no extraneous meaning. But there's another kind of music in terms of classical, which is program music. Are you familiar with that?
Speak again a little bit louder.
Okay, are you familiar with
The distinction between absolute and program music?
Yes.
Not by those words, and not no.
So program music is not just for its own sake. It's intentionally tells a story or paints a picture or describes a scene For instance, Beethoven's Sixth Symphony, the Pastoral, was the first piece of program music. Then you have Vivaldi with the Four Seasons and various other people who wrote program music. And so I struggle a little bit with that idea that music is this abstract thing that everyone can interpret in its own way, because that's a particular type of music, but there's not a whole lot of that. In classical music, it became very programmatic and very intentional. And the composer would, specifically choose chord progressions or keys or instrumentation, structure, form to relate a message. So I'm wondering how thinking about music in this way might enrich the conversation that we're having.
No, I appreciate that. And so, as you were saying that, of course, it immediately clicked to me what you mean by program music. I had played with my kids, I think it's Haydn's Farewell Symphony recently. There's a good example.
They start disappearing.
Right,
Yes.
and there's a clear message in there, right? So, and I certainly didn't mean to imply that that's exactly how I was seeing music, or that it was purely in some sort of abstract realm, but that everyone will still have an experience, a felt experience of moving through that program. And I'll just add one of the ways we're looking at this particular way of understanding brain dynamics is with story, literal, right? So there's a clear program, and so we can look at the shapes of stories as well and see that. So we're using the same methods in that way. And I see Sheila's given me that wink, wink, nod, nod. And we definitely don't want anyone to miss out on lunch. So it's time to wrap up.
Great.
Thank you, everybody.
Sure.